Architectures of sound. The history of human civilization is typically charted through the visual evidence of its legacy: the crumbling limestone of the pyramids, the intricate marble veins of the Parthenon, the soaring stained glass of Gothic cathedrals, and the gleaming steel skeletons of the modern metropolis. We are a species that prioritizes the eye, documenting our ascent through the tangible, static structures we leave behind. Yet there exists a shadow history of architecture, a parallel narrative constructed not of granite and glass, but of compression and rarefaction, of resonance and reverberation. This is the history of the architecture of sound, an invisible discipline that has shaped human experience as profoundly as any physical wall or roof. For millennia, humanity has engaged in a relentless dialogue with the acoustic environment. We have moved from the terrifying, uncontrollable acoustics of the natural world, the thunderclap, the roar of the waterfall, the echo of the canyon, to the constructed sanctity of the stone circle, the divine reverberation of the cathedral, the calculated precision of the concert hall, and finally, the hermetically sealed silence of the recording studio. This evolution reflects a fundamental shift in our relationship with the cosmos, from a desire to commune with the environment to a compulsion to control, capture, and eventually manufacture it. To understand this journey is to understand that space is never truly empty. It is a medium, a chaotic ocean of air molecules waiting to be agitated into meaning. How we shape that space determines how we hear, and consequently, how we think, worship, and govern. This review explores that trajectory, beginning with the intuitive acoustic wonders of the ancient world and expanding into the complex engineered resonance of the modern era, revealing how the manipulation of sound has been a primary, if often overlooked, driver of architectural innovation. Greek and Roman amphitheater. The theaters of classical antiquity represent the most enduring and visibly sophisticated examples of pre-industrial acoustic engineering. While often romanticized as the product of lost mystical knowledge or fortuitous geographical placement, the acoustic clarity of sites like the Theater of Epidaurus is the result of rigorous, albeit empirical, geometric application. Constructed in the 4th century BC on the slopes of Mount Canorthian, the theater at Epidaurus accommodates approximately 14,000 spectators, yet it is renowned for an acoustic intimacy that belies its massive scale. A spectator seated in the uppermost tier, nearly 60 meters from the orchestra, can hear the unamplified speech of an actor with startling clarity. For centuries, this phenomenon was attributed to the prevailing winds or the specific resonance of the mountainside. However, modern acoustic analysis reveals that the architecture itself functions as a complex acoustic filter. The semicircular koilon, or auditorium, is not a simple bowl. It is a corrugated surface composed of limestone seats. The tiered arrangement, with a slope of roughly 26 degrees in the lower section and a steeper incline in the upper tiers, the epitheatron, serves a dual purpose. First, the steep rake ensures a direct line of sight and, consequently, a direct line of sound from the speaker to the listener. In a flat crowd, sound is rapidly attenuated as it grazes the heads and bodies of the audience, a phenomenon known as the seat dip effect, or grazing incidence attenuation. By elevating each row of listeners well above the row in front, the Greek architects ensured that the direct sound wave traveled through the air unobstructed. Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BC, described sound as expanding in concentric waves, akin to a pebble dropped in water. He understood that for intelligibility, this wavefront must remain unbroken. Second, and perhaps more ingeniously, the limestone seats themselves act as a frequency-selective filter. The dimensions of the seat risers and the cavities between rows create a corrugated surface that interacts with sound waves. This structure effectively suppresses low-frequency background noise, the murmur of the crowd, the rustle of wind in trees, the distant low thrum of the landscape, while reflecting and reinforcing high-frequency sounds. The frequency range of the human voice, particularly the consonants that carry semantic meaning, such as S, T, and K sounds, resides in the higher spectrum. By attenuating the muddying low frequencies and preserving the articulate high frequencies, the stone architecture of Epidaurus acts as a passive equalizer, stripping away noise to leave a pristine vocal signal. This acoustic engineering was not limited to the seats. The orchestra, the circular performance space at the center, was paved with hard earth or stone. This created a strong primary reflection, bouncing the actor's voice upward into the auditorium. This early reflection arrives at the listener's ear within milliseconds of the direct sound. The human brain integrates these two signals, the direct and the reflected, into a single, louder auditory event, a psychoacoustic phenomenon that prefigured modern amplification by 2 millennia. While the Greeks relied on geometry, the Romans introduced active acoustic devices. Vitruvius describes the use of bronze sounding vessels, or achaea, placed in niches around the theater, tuned to specific musical intervals. These resonators were intended to vibrate sympathetically with the actors' voices, amplifying specific frequencies to enhance projection and tone. Although no physical examples of these vessels survive in situ, their description in De Architectura confirms that ancient architects viewed the theater not just as a viewing place, theatron, but a giant musical instrument to be tuned. Land as archive. In cultures that did not construct monumental stone theaters, the landscape itself was engaged as an acoustic architecture. For the indigenous peoples of Australia, the continent is crisscrossed by an invisible network of song lines or dreaming tracks. These are not merely mythical pathways, but a complex navigational and archival system encoded in sound. The songline utilizes the acoustic features of the topography to preserve and transmit essential knowledge across vast distances and generations. A songline functions as an auditory map. The melodic contour of the song directly correlates to the physical contour of the land. A rising melodic phrase might indicate an ascent up a ridge. A disjointed staccato rhythm might signify rugged, rocky terrain. A long, flowing legato line could represent a river or open plain. As the traveler walks the land, they sing the song, and the song guides their feet. The landscape serves as a mnemonic device, triggering the acoustic memory, while the song serves as a navigational tool, unlocking the landscape. The acoustic properties of specific sites, canyons, rock overhangs, and valleys are integral to this system. These natural formations act as amplifiers and resonators. In the silence of the Australian bush, a voice singing a songline can carry for kilometers when projected from a specific rock ledge or into a valley that focuses the sound. The interaction is reciprocal. The singer activates the land through sound, and the land's acoustic response, its echo and reverberation, confirms the traveler's location. This embodied ecological memory ensures that if one knows the song, one can never be lost, even in unfamiliar territory, as the song provides the instructions for survival, detailing water sources and food availability. Similarly, in the dense rainforests and savannas of West and Central Africa, the talking drum represents a sophisticated manipulation of acoustic architecture to overcome the barriers of geography. The dundun of the Yoruba people is often misunderstood by Westerners as a purely musical instrument. It is, in fact, a speech surrogate. Many West African languages are tonal. The meaning of a syllable changes entirely depending on its pitch. The hourglass-shaped dundun, with its tension cords connecting the two drum heads, allows the player to alter the pitch of the drum in real time. By squeezing the cords under the arm, The drummer can mimic the prosody, tone, and rhythm of human speech with high fidelity. Architecture here is the atmosphere itself. Low-frequency sounds travel further and penetrate vegetation better than high-frequency sounds, which are easily absorbed by leaves and tree trunks. The talking drum utilizes this principle, producing a resonant boom that can be heard up to 20 kilometers away. This allowed for a wireless communication network long before the telegraph, facilitating the transmission of complex messages, birth announcements, warnings of war, and praise poetry across vast distances. The drummer utilizes the acoustic transparency of the dawn or dusk air when the temperature gradient refracts sound waves downward, extending their range, effectively turning the village square into a broadcast station. Megalithic Chamber. Moving from the open air to the enclosed void, the megalithic structures of Neolithic Europe present a different kind of acoustic intentionality. Sites like Newgrange in Ireland, circa 3200 BC, and Stonehenge in England, circa 2500 BC, are often analyzed for their astronomical alignments, but their acoustic properties are equally profound and likely central to their ritual function. Newgrange, a massive passage tomb, features a 19-meter-long stone-lined passageway leading to a cruciform central chamber with a corbelled roof. Acoustical studies of this chamber reveal a powerful resonance at approximately 110 Hz. This frequency falls within the lower range of the male baritone voice. When a person chants at this pitch inside the chamber, the sound waves reinforce each other, creating a standing wave. The subjective experience is intense. The sound seems to detach from the singer and fill the room, vibrating the air and the bodies of those present. The specific choice of dimensions that yield this 110 Hz resonance appears in multiple Neolithic sites, including the Hypogeum in Malta and various cairns in the UK. Neuroacoustic research suggests that exposure to sounds at this frequency can shift prefrontal cortex activity, potentially inducing altered states of consciousness or trance. Thus, the architecture of Newgrange was not just a tomb, it was a psychotropic technology. The roof box above the entrance, while famous for admitting the winter solstice light, also serves as an acoustic aperture, allowing communication between the dead inside and the living outside. Stonehenge, in its complete form, with the outer sarsen circle and the inner trilithons, would have functioned as a remarkable acoustic arena. The large, flat surfaces of the dressed sarsen stones act as acoustic mirrors. With the circle complete, sound generated in the center would be reflected back inward, creating a reverberant, amplified field. This design creates a stark acoustic boundary. To an observer standing outside the circle, the rituals inside would be muffled and indistinct, effectively silenced by the wall of stone. To a participant inside, the sound of drums or chanting would be thunderous and enveloping. This acoustic isolation reinforced the social hierarchy, separating the initiated few within the circle from the uninitiated masses outside. The architecture of Stonehenge did not just mark the land, it partitioned the soundscape, creating a private auditory realm for the sacred in the middle of an open plain. Cathedral Acoustics. As civilization moved from the Stone Age into the era of complex masonry and eventually the Industrial Revolution, the architecture of sound underwent a profound transformation. The reliance on natural resonance and single reflection geometry gave way to the deliberate construction of enclosed volumes designed to sustain, color, and distribute sound. This period, spanning the rise of the great cathedrals to the dawn of the radio age, marks the renaissance of resonance, where the building itself became the primary instrument of musical and religious expression. The medieval cathedral stands as the most ambitious acoustic enclosure in history. While often analyzed through the lens of light, the theology of the stained glass window, The cathedral was equally defined by the theology of the echo. In the vast naves of Chartres, Notre Dame, or Durham, the sheer volume of enclosed air, combined with the hardness of stone and glass, created reverberation times that could exceed 10 seconds. In such a space, sound does not die, it accumulates. This extreme reverberation was not an architectural error. It was a liturgical necessity that shaped the evolution of Western sacred music. The acoustics of the Gothic cathedral effectively rendered distinct, articulate speech unintelligible. A sermon spoken at a conversational pace would dissolve into a muddy wash of overlapping syllables. Consequently, the liturgy was chanted. The slow, drawn-out vowels of Gregorian chant were perfectly adapted to the building's decay time. The stone walls acted as a sustain pedal, blending individual voices into a single disembodied unity. This diffuse field minimized the individuality of the singer and emphasized the collective mystery of the church. The architecture enforced a theology where the specific semantic content of the word was secondary to the overwhelming, enveloping presence of the holy sound. The Protestant Reformation brought a violent disruption to this acoustic order. The theological shift from the mystery of the sacrament to the clarity of the sermon necessitated a new acoustic architecture. Reformers like Calvin and Zwingli stripped churches of their popish ornaments, statues, tapestries, side altars, and intricate rood screens. While the intent was iconoclastic, the result was acoustic. These ornaments had functioned as sound diffusers, scattering reflections and breaking up the focused echoes that muddied speech. Their removal, combined with the stark, whitewashed walls, often made the acoustics worse for speech, introducing harsh flutter echoes. In response, Protestant architecture evolved toward the auditory church, or preaching house. These spaces were smaller, with lower ceilings, and often constructed with galleries to reduce the volume of air and bring the congregation closer to the pulpit. The goal was to reduce reverberation to a level where the spoken word of God could be clearly understood by all. This tension between clarity, the Protestant ideal, and mystery, the Catholic acoustic, defined religious architecture for centuries. The building was no longer just a house of worship. It was a dogmatic filter, physically constructed to favor either the intelligible sermon or the mystical chant. The interaction between architecture and music reached a zenith in Venice at St. Mark's Basilica. Unlike the long, narrow naves of Northern Europe, St. Mark's is built on a Byzantine plan, with 5 massive domes and a complex arrangement of transepts. This geometry created distinct acoustic zones where sound could easily become fragmented. In the 16th century, the maestro di cappella, Adrian Willaert, turned this potential defect into a revolutionary musical style. Willaert and his successors, notably Giovanni Gabrieli, utilized the pergoli, the split choir lofts positioned high on opposing walls of the sanctuary. By placing separate choirs and instrumental groups in these lofts, they created the cori spizzati style. The architecture acted as a mixer. A phrase sung from the left gallery would travel across the nave to be answered by the right, meeting in the center to create a stereophonic wash of sound. The composers wrote specifically for this delay, using homophonic textures, chords moving together, to ensure clarity within the reverberance. St. Mark's Basilica essentially composed the polychoral style. The music was a direct mapping of the building's acoustic geography. Birth of the concert hall, the secularization of sound. As music migrated from the cathedral and the court into the public sphere during the 18th and 19th centuries, a new architectural typology emerged, the concert hall. This shift was driven by the changing sociology of music, the rise of the paying bourgeois audience, and the evolution of the symphonic form, which demanded a space that balanced the clarity of the preaching house with the warmth of the cathedral. The pinnacle of this era is the shoebox hall, exemplified by the Grosser Musikverein Saal in Vienna, 1870, the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, 1888, and the Boston Symphony Hall, 1900. These halls are revered today as the finest acoustic spaces in the world, yet their design was largely the result of evolutionary intuition rather than calculation. The shoebox design is characterized by a rectangular floor plan, high ceilings, and crucially, a narrow width. The narrowness is the secret to their acoustic success. In a narrow hall, the sound reflecting off the sidewalls reaches the listener very shortly after the direct sound from the stage. These early lateral reflections are vital. They trick the brain into perceiving the sound source as wider than it is, creating a sensation of envelopment or apparent source width. Contrast this with the fan-shaped auditoriums that became popular in the mid-20th century. In a wide fan shape, the sidewalls are too far away. The reflections arrive too late and are too weak, leaving the listener with a sense of acoustic detachment, as if looking at the music through a window rather than being in it. The high ceilings of the shoebox provided the necessary volume of air to sustain the low-frequency energy of the orchestra, giving the music its warmth and presence. A persistent myth surrounding these 19th century halls is that they function like giant musical instruments with thin wood paneling vibrating to amplify the sound. This is a romantic misconception. In reality, the acoustic excellence of the Musikverein or Boston Symphony Hall relies on the exact opposite principle: massive rigidity. The walls of these halls are typically constructed of heavy plaster applied directly to thick masonry or solid timber framing. This heavy, rigid boundary ensures that sound energy is reflected back into the room rather than being absorbed by the walls. If the walls were thin enough to vibrate significantly, like the body of a cello, they would absorb bass frequencies, stripping the orchestra of its power and leaving a thin, tinny sound. The wood visible in these halls is often a veneer or a heavy cladding that contributes to the psychological warmth of the space, but serves a reflective, not resonant, acoustic function. The heavily ornamented aesthetic of 19th century architecture, the caryatids, the coffered ceilings, the pilasters, and the golded statues served a critical, if unintended, acoustic purpose. These irregular surfaces act as sound diffusers. When sound hits a flat, smooth wall, it reflects in a single direction, specular reflection, much like light off a mirror. This can create harsh, glaring sound or specific flutter echoes. The complex surfaces of the Musikverein, the statues of women, the intricate molding, the balconies, scatter high-frequency sound waves in thousands of directions. This diffusion blends the sound of the individual instruments, taking the edge off the violins and creating the velvety, blended tone for which the Vienna Philharmonic is famous. The golden sound is quite literally the result of the gold-leafed statues breaking up the sound waves. As modernism stripped architecture of ornament in the 20th century, architects unwittingly stripped rooms of this essential diffusive quality, leading to the sterile, harsh acoustics of many mid-century concrete halls. The transition from the intuitive shoebox era to the scientific age of acoustics occurred in 1895 in a lecture hall at Harvard University. The Fogg Art Museum Lecture Hall was an acoustic disaster, a semicircular room with a dome that rendered speech unintelligible. The task of fixing it fell to a young physics professor named Wallace Clement Sabine. Sabine spent night after night moving seat cushions from the nearby Sanders Theater into the Fogg Lecture Hall, timing how long it took for sound to decay. Through this tedious experimentation, he discovered the mathematical relationship between the volume of a room, the amount of sound-absorbing material, and the reverberation time. he established the sabine as the unit of sound absorption. For the first time, acoustics was no longer a dark art or a byproduct of structural necessity. It was a calculated variable. This allowed for the design of Boston Symphony Hall, the first concert hall in history to be acoustically calculated before construction. However, this scientific triumph also led to a reductionistic view of acoustics that prioritized reverberation time above all else, often ignoring the complex geometry of reflections that the old shoeboxes got right by accident. Dawn of mechanical sound reproduction, the architecture of the signal. The turn of the 20th century brought a disruption to the architecture of sound even more radical than the Reformation. The invention of the phonograph and the radio decoupled sound from its physical source. For the first time in human history, a performance in a concert hall in London could be heard in a living room in New York. This did not just change music, it fundamentally altered the architecture of the domestic sphere and the concept of listening space. When the phonograph first appeared, it was a scientific curiosity, a machine of exposed brass, rotating cylinders, and a large intrusive horn. In the Victorian home, which was strictly coded by gender and decorum, such a mechanical intruder was unwelcome in the parlor. The parlor was the domain of the woman, a space of social performance and aesthetic harmony. A piece of industrial machinery disrupted this carefully curated domestic architecture. To survive, the phonograph had to become architecturalized. It had to become furniture. By the 1910s and 20s, manufacturers like Edison and Victor began enclosing the mechanism in elaborate wooden cabinets. These consoles were designed in Chippendale, Sheraton, or Queen Anne styles to blend seamlessly with the existing furniture. The horn, the actual acoustic amplifier, was folded inside the cabinet, its opening hidden behind grills of velour de gens or intricate wood latticework. This cultural camouflage was essential. It allowed the source of the sound to disappear, leaving only the music. The phonograph became a piece of talking furniture, a household god that occupied the corner of the room. This shifted the focus of the room. Where the layout of the parlor had traditionally centered on the fireplace or the piano, it now began to pivot toward the console. The architecture of listening became private and domestic rather than public and communal. The arrival of the radio accelerated this architectural shift. If the phonograph was a musical archive, the radio was a live connection to the outside world. It replaced the fireplace as the hearth of the home, the focal point around which the family gathered. Architectural magazines and interior designers in the 1920s and 30s began to grapple with this new presence. The radio receiver, often housed in a cathedral-style cabinet, became the anchor of the living room. The furniture arrangement shifted to face the speaker, creating a semicircle of attention directed at a wooden box. This was a profound change in domestic proxemics. The family sat together, yet their attention was directed outward toward an invisible source. The radio also blurred the boundary between the private and the public architectural sphere. The sanctuary of the home was now permeable to the noises of the city, the news of the war, and the sounds of the jazz club. This necessitated a new kind of domestic management. The volume knob became the gatekeeper of the domestic soundscape, a tool to regulate the intrusion of the outside world into the private architecture of the home. While the home was being transformed into a listening chamber, the source of the sound, the broadcast studio, was evolving into a new anti-architectural typology, the dead room. Early radio engineers realized that if a broadcast studio had the reverberant acoustics of a normal room, and the listener's living room also had reverberation, the result was a confused, muddy sound. To achieve clarity, the architecture of the studio had to be acoustically erased. Studios were lined with heavy monk's cloth drapes, thick carpets, and felt padding. The goal was to eliminate all reflections, creating an anechoic environment where the only sound captured was the direct signal from the performer. This was the antithesis of the cathedral. The cathedral was built to sustain sound. The studio was built to kill it instantly. This dead architecture fundamentally changed the nature of musical performance. It gave birth to the crooner. Singers like Bing Crosby could not have existed in an unamplified opera house where they would have to project to the back row. In the dead silence of the studio, Crosby could lean close to the microphone and sing with a whisper-like intimacy. This created a new psychoacoustic relationship. The listener in the living room felt as though the singer was sitting right next to them, murmuring into their ear. The architecture of the dead studio and the camouflaged radio console conspired to collapse the distance between the performer and the audience, creating an illusion of intimacy that was purely a product of architectural manipulation. Ultimately, the era of mechanical reproduction introduced the concept of displaced architecture. A listener sitting in a small, carpeted, dry living room could put on a record of a symphony recorded in the music verein. The physical walls of the room remained stationary, but the acoustic horizon expanded to the dimensions of the concert hall. This led to a phenomenon known as schizophonia, the splitting of a sound from its source. The architecture of the home became a phantom state, capable of hosting the acoustics of a cathedral, a jazz club, or a political rally at the flip of a switch. Early 20th century phonograph parties attempted to manage this dissonance by dimming the lights and arranging chairs in rows, trying to visually simulate the concert hall that was aurally present. The history of human auditory culture is defined by a singular transformative rupture, the decoupling of sound from its source. For millennia, the sonic experience was ephemeral, bound strictly to the physical proximity of an event and the acoustic properties of the immediate environment. A performance existed only in the moment of its execution, dissipating instantly into thermal energy, surviving only in the fallible memory of the witness. The architecture of sound was the architecture of physical space, the cathedral, the amphitheater, the cave. The dawn of the electric age, however, introduced a new paradigm. It did not merely amplify this reality, it fundamentally reorganized the ontology of audio. Sound became a signal, an artifact that could be captured, manipulated, stored, and projected across time and space. This second part explores the evolution of this engineered soundscape, tracing the arc from the first crude electrical transductions to the infinite generative possibilities of artificial intelligence. The transition from acoustic to electric audio was not a singular invention, but a convergence of physics, engineering, and artistic necessity. It required the development of a complete signal chain, a mechanism to hear, the microphone, a mechanism to think and boost, the amplifier, and a mechanism to speak, the loudspeaker. This triad formed the nervous system of modern media, allowing culture to be industrialized and distributed on a global scale. Microphones and loudspeakers. The genesis of modern audio lies in the concept of transduction, the conversion of one form of energy into another. In the context of sound, it meant translating the longitudinal pressure waves of air, acoustic energy, into analogous electrical signals, voltage. This technological leap began in the late 19th century, a period of fervent innovation that would define the sensory experience of the 20th century. While historical narratives often highlight Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, the lineage of the microphone, the ear of the machine, is complex and multi-layered. In 1875, David Edward Hughes invented a crude carbon microphone, a device that relied on loosely packed carbon granules to modulate electrical current in response to sound waves. This invention, which predated the more commercially refined patents of Edison and Berliner, established the fundamental principle that sound could be imprinted onto an electrical current. Hughes, driven by scientific altruism, chose not to patent his invention, viewing it as a gift to mankind, a decision that accelerated the development of early telephony. This early carbon technology, though low in fidelity and prone to noise, was the catalyst for a century of telecommunications. Parallel to the capture of sound was the challenge of its reproduction. The loudspeaker, the mouth of the system, underwent a similar evolution. The first patents for electrodynamic transducers, the ancestors of the modern speaker, were filed in the 1870s by visionaries like Werner von Siemens and Alexander Graham Bell. However, these early devices were primarily used for telephony, producing faint, tinny reproductions suitable only for speech intelligibility, not musical enjoyment. It was not until 1898 that Oliver Lodge patented the moving coil loudspeaker, the direct progenitor of the dynamic drivers found in nearly every sound system today. Lodge's design utilized a magnetic field to drive a coil and diaphragm, a mechanism that allowed for greater excursion and, consequently, louder and more accurate sound reproduction. The true catalyst for the electric age arrived in 1906 with Lee de Forest's invention of the Audion, a vacuum tube triode capable of amplifying weak electrical signals. Before the Audion, audio signals could not be significantly boosted. Playback volume was limited by the mechanical energy captured by the recording stylus or the weak current of a telephone line. The Audion allowed for the amplification of these signals to room-filling volumes, enabling the development of public address systems and the electric phonograph. This triad of inventions, the microphone to capture, the amplifier to boost, and the loudspeaker to project, completed the signal chain, allowing sound to be detached from its source and recontextualized in new environments. By the 1920s, the implementation of the traditional voice coil speaker moved from patent diagrams to practical reality. The balanced armature principle, patented in 1908 and refined in the 1920s, offered an alternative transduction method, one that would later find its niche in hearing aids and high-end in-ear monitors due to its precision and compact size. These technologies did not merely improve communication, they birthed entirely new forms of entertainment. The ability to fill a cinema or a stadium with amplified sound meant that culture could be consumed collectively on a massive scale, shifting the paradigm of performance from the intimate parlor to the grand arena. Studio as an instrument, painting with sound. As the technologies of capture and playback matured, a secondary revolution occurred within the creative process itself. Initially, the recording studio was viewed strictly as a documentary tool, a space designed to capture a faithful rendition of a live performance. Engineers were akin to photographers, tasked with creating a transparent sonic photograph of an orchestra or jazz ensemble. However, beginning in the late 1940s and accelerating through the 1960s, a radical shift occurred. Visionary producers began to view the studio not as a passive mirror of reality, but as a compositional instrument, a laboratory where sounds could be fabricated, layered, and manipulated to create sonic realities that could never exist in a live setting. This conceptual leap is often summarized by the phrase, "the studio as an instrument," a philosophy pioneered by figures who blurred the lines between technician and artist. Among the earliest was Phil Spector, whose wall of sound technique in the 1960s treated the recording space as an echo chamber of immense density. Spector would cram large ensembles of musicians into relatively small rooms, instructing multiple instruments such as 3 pianos or 5 guitars to play the same parts simultaneously. The result was a dense monophonic roar that defied the spatial logic of a live band. Spector's productions, such as the 1963 hit Be My Baby, functioned as a Rosetta Stone for studio pioneers, demonstrating that a recording could be a constructed artifact rather than a document of a performance. Following Spector, George Martin and the Beatles pushed this philosophy into the realm of avant-garde experimentation. By 1966, with the track Tomorrow Never Knows, the studio had become a surrealist playground. Martin and the band utilized tape loops, segments of magnetic tape spliced end-to-end to repeat indefinitely, creating rhythmic and textural beds that were physically impossible to play live. They manipulated the speed of tape machines to alter the timbre of instruments and utilized the mixing console to fly in sounds on the fly. The studio control room became the cockpit of creativity, where the performance was constructed during the mixing stage rather than on the studio floor. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys further refined this approach with his modular recording technique. For Good Vibrations, Wilson recorded distinct musical sections in different studios to capture specific acoustic qualities, then spliced these disparate modules together to form a cohesive pop symphony. This editing process, physically cutting and taping magnetic tape, allowed for abrupt changes in texture and mood that became a hallmark of psychedelic pop. In the 1970s, Brian Eno emerged as the great theorist of this movement. Eno, a self-described non-musician, championed the idea that the recording studio democratized composition. He argued that one did not need manual dexterity to play the studio. One only needed the ability to make decisions. Eno emphasized the unique properties of magnetic tape, noting that unlike the rigid grooves of a gramophone disc, tape was malleable, reversible, and cuttable. His oblique strategies and ambient works treated the mixing desk as a synthesizer, using equalization, delay, and reverb to sculpt the timbre of recorded sound. For Eno, the mute button on a console was as important as a piano key, allowing the producer to subtractively arrange a dense improvisation into a structured piece. This evolution from capturing performance to constructing soundscapes laid the direct foundation for modern electronic music, hip-hop, and the digital audio workstation environment, where the distinction between musician and engineer has but vanished. Cinema's sonic revolution, from silence to surround. While music producers were redefining the studio, the film industry was undergoing a parallel sonic revolution that would fundamentally alter the grammar of visual storytelling. For the first 3 decades of its existence, cinema was a silent medium. Though it was rarely truly quiet, live musical accompaniment was standard. However, the synchronized integration of recorded sound, the talkies, shattered this silence and introduced dialogue as a narrative force. The transition began in earnest with technological experiments like Lee DeForest's phonofilm, 1923, which recorded sound directly onto the film strip as an optical waveform, and the Vitaphone system, 1926, which synchronized a film projector with a phonograph disc. The commercial tipping point arrived with Warner Brothers' The Jazz Singer, 1927, the first feature film to include synchronized dialogue sequences. The impact was seismic. The talkies demanded a complete overhaul of acting styles, production logistics, and theater infrastructure. The microphone became a dictator on set, forcing cameras into soundproof blimps to hide their mechanical noise and tethering actors to specific locations to ensure audibility. As the novelty of synchronized speech wore off, filmmakers began to explore the creative potential of the soundtrack. In 1933, 42nd Street utilized synchronized sound for elaborate musical numbers, proving that audio could drive spectacle as much as dialogue. But it was Disney's Fantasia, 1940, that heralded the future of immersive audio. Using a proprietary system called Fantasound, the film was the first to be released in stereo, utilizing multiple audio channels to move sound across the screen. This experiment, though commercially unwieldy at the time, sowed the seeds for the surround sound formats that would emerge decades later. The modern era of cinematic sound was ushered in by Dolby Laboratories. Ray Dolby, who founded the company in 1965, first revolutionized the music industry with noise reduction technology, before turning his attention to film. In 1975, Dolby Stereo was introduced, a practical 35mm optical format that encoded 4 channels of audio, left, center, right, and surround, into 2 physical tracks on the film strip. This allowed for a standardized, high-fidelity surround experience that could be played in properly equipped theaters while remaining compatible with older mono systems. The release of Star Wars 1977 and Close Encounters of the Third Kind 1977 demonstrated the visceral power of Dolby Stereo, making sound effects, the hum of a lightsaber, the roar of a spaceship, equal partners to the visual effects. This evolution reached a new zenith with Apocalypse Now 1979, a film that is widely credited with establishing the 5.1 surround sound format, incorporating a discrete low-frequency effects channel for subwoofers, and cementing the role of the sound designer. Walter Murch, the film's editor and sound mixer, coined the term sound designer to describe his holistic approach to the film's audio landscape. Murch's philosophy treated sound not just as a technical requirement, but as a psychological tool. He argued that sound could influence the audience's subconscious, using the ambiguity of audio to engage the viewer's imagination in ways that explicit visuals could not. His use of helicopter rotor sounds moving in a 360-degree circle around the audience in Apocalypse Now was not merely a gimmick, it was a narrative device intended to immerse the viewer in the disorienting, drug-induced haze of the protagonist's experience. By the 1990s, the transition to digital cinema sound was complete. Batman Returns 1992 premiered Dolby Digital, which encoded 6 discrete channels of digital audio onto the film print. This paved the way for the hyper-realistic soundscapes of modern blockbuster cinema, where the manipulation of dynamics, frequency, and spatial positioning is meticulously engineered to guide the audience's emotional journey. Digital revolution, compression, and the psychoacoustic model. If the electric age decoupled sound from its source, the digital age dematerialized it entirely. The transition from analog waveforms to binary code, streams of ones and zeros, represented a fundamental ontological shift. Sound was no longer a physical groove on a vinyl disc or a magnetic pattern on a tape. It became data. This datafication of audio enabled unprecedented levels of manipulation, storage, and transmission, giving rise to technologies that would reshape the music industry, the aesthetics of composition, and the very nature of listening. This digital era is not merely about fidelity, it is about the infinite plasticity of sound. The foundational technology of digital audio is pulse code modulation, PCM, invented by Alec Reeves in 1937, but not commercially realized until decades later. PCM captures an analog waveform by sampling its amplitude at regular intervals, sampling rate, and assigning a numerical value to that amplitude, bit depth. This process allows for the perfect reproduction of a waveform, theoretically forever, without the degradation inherent in analog copying. However, raw digital audio requires massive amounts of storage, a commodity that was scarce and expensive in the early days of computing and the internet. To solve the bandwidth problem, engineers turned to the science of perception. The development of the MP3, MEPG-1 audio layer 3 in the late 1980s and early 1990s by the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany was a triumph of psychoacoustics over brute force engineering. Led by Karl-Heinz Brandenburg, the MP3 team realized that the human ear is an imperfect sensor, We do not hear all frequencies equally, and our brain actively ignores certain sounds in the presence of others. The MP3 algorithm utilizes a psychoacoustic model to discard data that the human ear is unlikely to perceive. This process relies heavily on the principle of auditory masking. Simultaneous or spectral masking occurs when a loud sound and a quiet sound occur simultaneously at similar frequencies. The physiology of the inner ear means the loud sound masks the quiet one, rendering it inaudible to the conscious mind. The MP3 encoder detects this relationship and removes the data for the quiet sound, as the listener wouldn't hear it anyway. Furthermore, temporal masking exploits the ear's latency. A loud sound can obscure quieter sounds that occur immediately before it, pre-masking or post-masking. The ear's recovery time from a loud transient allows the encoder to delete the quieter details in that brief window without the listener noticing the absence. By aggressively removing this perceptually irrelevant information, MP3s could achieve compression ratios of 10:1 or 12:1 compared to CD-quality audio, reducing file sizes by over 90% while maintaining acceptable fidelity. A pivotal moment in the tuning of the MP3 involved Suzanne Vega's song, Tom's Diner. Karl-Heinz Brandenburg used an a cappella version of this track as a benchmark for the codec. The song Simplicity, a solo female voice with natural room ambience, proved to be a torture test for early compression algorithms, which struggled to reproduce the subtle nuances of the human voice without introducing swirly or unnatural artifacts. Brandenburg listened to the track thousands of times, tweaking the algorithm until Vega's voice sounded natural. This contribution earned Vega the moniker, the mother of the MP3, illustrating how a single artistic work can shape the technical infrastructure of an entire medium. The rise of the MP3 facilitated the explosion of file-sharing platforms like Napster and the dominance of portable players like the iPod, decoupling music from physical media entirely. However, this digital precision also led to the loudness wars. With the physical limitations of vinyl, where loud bass could cause the needle to jump, removed, engineers in the 1990s and 2000s began using digital brick wall limiters to push the average volume of tracks as high as possible. Albums like Metallica's Death Magnetic 2008 became notorious for being compressed to the point of audible distortion, sacrificing dynamic range for sheer volume. By 2026, the industry has largely pivoted away from this war. Streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music now enforce loudness normalization standards, typically -14 LUFS or -16 LUFS, which automatically turn down loud tracks to match a consistent playback volume. This has effectively disarmed the loudness war. Mastering a track to be hyper loud no longer makes it sound louder to the listener. It just sounds less dynamic when the platform turns it down. This shift has encouraged a return to dynamic range in modern production, prioritizing clarity and impact over sustained volume. Synthesizers and sampling, the recontextualization of sound. While compression changed how we consume sound, synthesis and sampling changed how we create it. The trajectory from analog synthesis to digital sampling represents a shift from sculpting electricity to collaging reality. The early history of electronic instruments, from the telharmonium to the theremin, focused on generating sound from scratch using oscillators. The analog synthesizers of the 1960s and 70s, pioneered by Robert Moog, used voltage-controlled oscillators to create rich, harmonically complex waveforms. These instruments were prized for their warmth, a psychoacoustic quality often attributed to the even-order harmonic distortion and slight pitch instabilities inherent in analog circuitry. However, the late 1970s introduced a disruptive concept, sampling. Instead of synthesizing a waveform, a machine could record a snippet of real-world sound, convert it to digital data, and allow it to be played back across a keyboard at different pitches. The Fairlight CMI, computer musical instrument, released in 1979, was the first commercially available digital sampling synthesizer. It allowed artists like Kate Bush and Peter Gabriel to incorporate concrete sounds, breaking glass, rhythmic breathing, orchestral stabs into their pop compositions, pioneering a new textural vocabulary. The democratization of this technology arrived with the Akai MPC series, specifically the MPC-60 launched in 1988. Designed by Roger Lynn, the MPC replaced the piano keyboard with a 4x4 grid of pressure-sensitive rubber pads. This interface was revolutionary. It allowed producers to play drums and samples rhythmically with their fingers, fostering a tactile, percussive approach to melody and arrangement. The MPC became the foundational instrument of hip-hop. Its limited sampling time, initially only 13 seconds on the MPC-60, forced producers to be creative, leading to the technique of chopping samples, taking a small segment of a jazz or soul record and slicing it into individual hits that could be rearranged into entirely new patterns. Jay Dilla, a virtuoso of the MPC, famously disabled the quantize function, which automatically aligns notes to a rigid grid. By playing his drum patterns manually and leaving them uncorrected, he created a signature drunk or off-kilter swing that humanized the digital machine. His MPC 3000 is now housed in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, a testament to its cultural weight. Similarly, Kanye West utilized the MPC to pioneer the chipmunk soul sound, speeding up vocal samples to high pitches, and later used the device for live performance, treating the sampler as a lead instrument. This era also birthed complex legal frameworks. The Wild West of early sampling, where artists could lift entire grooves without clearance, as seen in the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight, using Chic's Good Times, came to a halt with lawsuits like Grand Upright Music Limited versus Warner Brothers Records, Inc., 1991, which ruled against Biz Markie for unauthorized sampling. This forced the industry to adopt strict clearance protocols, changing the aesthetic of hip-hop from the dense, multi-layered collages of the 1980s, example The Bomb Squad, to more sparse compositions relying on single, cleared loops or interpolated replays. Emergence of spatial audio, immersion and object-based mixing. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the stereo paradigm, two channels, left and right, that dominated the 20th century is being superseded by spatial audio. This new architecture of sound aims to replicate the way humans hear in the real world, spherically, with depth, height, and precise localization. The holy grail of spatial audio is the head-related transfer function, HRTF. In the real world, we locate sound sources with subtle cues. The interaural time difference, ITD, dictates that a sound coming from the right hits the right ear microseconds before the left. The interaural level difference, ILD, occurs because the head casts an acoustic shadow, making sounds quieter in the ear further from the source. Most critically, the complex folds of the outer ear, pinna, reflect and filter sound waves differently depending on their vertical angle, elevation. This spectral fingerprint tells our brain if a sound is above or below us. Spatial audio systems use algorithms to apply these HRTF filters to digital audio signals. When listened to over headphones, this tricks the brain into perceiving sounds as originating from specific points in 3D space, rather than inside the head as with traditional stereo. The dominant format driving this revolution is Dolby Atmos. Unlike traditional channel-based systems, 5.1, 7.1, which assign sounds to specific speakers, like play this in the rear left speaker, Atmos is object-based. An Atmos mix consists of a bed, traditional channels for ambience, and objects, individual audio elements like a helicopter or a voice. Each object is accompanied by metadata that defines its X, Y, and Z coordinates in 3D space at any given moment. The playback system, whether a cinema processor, a home receiver, or a smartphone, renders these objects in real time to fit the available speakers. If a theater has 64 speakers, the helicopter sound pans smoothly across them. If a home bar has only 10, the system calculates the best way to represent that trajectory using the available drivers. This technology has expanded beyond cinema into music. Apple Music's spatial audio implementation uses Dolby Atmos to deliver immersive mixes to headphones. To enhance realism, devices like the AirPods Pro use gyroscopes for dynamic head tracking. If the user turns their head to the left, the audio field rotates right, keeping the virtual speakers anchored in space relative to the screen. By 2025-2026, the next frontier is personalized HRTF. Using smartphone cameras, users can scan their own ears to generate a custom HRTF profile, ensuring the spatial filtering matches their unique anatomy perfectly, resolving issues where generic profiles sound blurry or lack externalization. The pinnacle of spatial audio in the physical world is the Sphere in Las Vegas, powered by holoplot technology. The Sphere utilizes wave field synthesis, a physics-based approach that differs fundamentally from traditional stereo or surround. Instead of using a few speakers to create a phantom center, an illusion that breaks if you move out of the sweet spot, WFS uses massive arrays of thousands of speakers to physically reconstruct the wavefront of a sound source. The system can steer beams of sound to specific locations using beamforming technology. It can target a specific section of the audience with one language track, while another section hears another language, all from the same speaker array with minimal bleed. This allows for virtual sources that appear to originate from mid-air, close to the listener, regardless of where they are seated in the massive venue. It effectively eliminates the sweet spot, giving every seat a perfect audio experience. Adaptive and interactive audio in gaming. In the interactive realm of video games, linear audio is insufficient. The soundscape must react to the player's agency. This is achieved through adaptive audio middleware tools like Wise and Fmod, which serve as the engine under the hood of game audio. One of the most celebrated examples of this is the 2012 video game Journey. Composer Austin Wintory created a score that functions as a cello concerto, where the player is the soloist. The music adapts seamlessly to gameplay states. When the player discovers a companion, another online player, the music engine dynamically crossfades to layers containing harps and violas, musically representing the joy of companionship without a single line of dialogue. The game's ending track, Apotheosis, was notoriously difficult to score, eventually matching the visual fade-out with an orchestral fade-out inspired by a live concert technique, leaving only the player's cello solo at the summit. Similarly, The Last of Us Part 2 2020 pushed adaptive audio to new heights with its Listen mode, a mechanic that visualizes enemy sounds through walls. The developers utilized raycasting audio occlusion, where the game engine calculates in real time how sound is muffled by obstacles, walls, glass, doors, dynamically altering the EQ and volume of enemy footsteps. The game also features a fully simulated guitar minigame where players can strum chords on the touchpad, a feature so robust it allows for free-form musical performance within the narrative. In Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, Developers worked with neuroscientists and voice hearers to accurately depict the protagonist's psychosis. They used binaural recording with microphones placed in a dummy head's ears for the furies, the voices in Senwa's head. When played with headphones, these voices sound frighteningly close, whispering directly into the player's ear, creating an empathetic simulation of auditory hallucinations. Generative audio, the AI frontier. As we look toward 2026, the newest disruption is generative AI. Just as the camera captured reality and the synthesizer simulated it, AI is now hallucinating it. Modern AI audio generation relies on two main architectures: transformers and diffusion models. Transformers, like the architecture behind LLMs, treat audio as a sequence of tokens, predicting the next millisecond of sound based on the previous ones. This is effective for structure and melody. Diffusion models, widely used in image generators like Stable Diffusion, work by starting with noise or static and iteratively refining it into a clear spectrogram, a visual representation of sound, based on a text prompt. This spectrogram is then converted back into audio. Diffusion is particularly good at generating rich textures and timbres. Applications like Suno and Udio allow users to generate full radio-quality songs from a simple text prompt, a sad jazz song about rain in Tokyo. In 2026, these tools are moving beyond novelty, offering stem separation and in-painting, changing just the drum beat or the lyrics of an existing audio file. However, the ability to clone voices has ignited ethical firestorms. In 2024, OpenAI faced controversy when their Sky voice assistant sounded eerily similar to actress Scarlett Johansson, despite her refusal to license her voice. This incident highlighted the legal gray areas of voice likeness and the right of publicity, setting the stage for strict regulations on biometric voice data in 2025 and 2026. The industry is now moving toward ethical AI models trained on licensed datasets to avoid copyright infringement. Beyond music, audio architecture is expanding into science through data sonification, the translation of non-audio data into sound. NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory has pioneered this field. The famous Sound of the Perseus Black Hole project took pressure waves rippling through the hot gas of a galaxy cluster, waves that are physically real sound waves but pitched 57 octaves below human hearing, and resynthesized them up into the audible range. The result is a haunting deep drone that allows us to hear the gravitational churn of the cosmos. This is not just artistic. Sonification allows blind and low-vision researchers to analyze astronomical data patterns that might be missed in visual graphs. Interestingly, as the digital realm becomes infinitely capable, there is a powerful psychological counter-movement, the analog resurgence. In 2025-26, sales of vinyl records and tube amplifiers continue to grow. This is not merely nostalgia, it is rooted in psychoacoustics. Tube amplifiers produce even-order harmonic distortion, second, fourth harmonics, which create musical intervals, octaves, that the human ear finds pleasing and warm. In contrast, early solid-state digital clipping produced odd-order harmonics, third, fifth harmonics, which can sound harsh or dissonant. The ritual of physical media, the needle drop, the artwork, the inability to skip tracks offers a mindful listening experience that serves as an antidote to the infinite algorithmic scroll of the digital age. Finally, the field of acoustic ecology, pioneered by R. Murray Schafer and the World Soundscape Project, is finding new relevance in urban planning. Planners are now designing cities not just for the eye, but for the ear, managing anthropophony, human noise, to preserve biophony, nature sounds, and geophony, wind, water. The goal is to create urban soundscapes that promote mental health, moving away from the sonic sewers of the industrial age towards acoustically balanced environments. From the carbon granules of the first microphone to the neural networks of generative AI, the history of engineered sound is a history of abstraction. We moved from capturing the air, electric, to constructing the room, studio, to encoding the wave, digital, to simulating the space, spatial, and finally to synthesizing the source, AI. Each architecture of sound has not only changed how we consume entertainment, but has rewired our relationship with reality itself. We no longer just listen to the world, we design it. As we enter the era of personalized spatial audio and infinite generative content, the challenge for the future will not be technological capability, but the preservation of the human connection, the ghost in the machine that makes sound truly resonate.